Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Going to have I'm going to finish off the long slew of Chris Owicki. They weren't his tweets originally, the ones he translated, someone else giving an analysis of the potential counteroffensive moves in Zaporija Oblast. But before we get there, let's have some more general discussion about the potential counteroffensive. Well, the counteroffensive it's not even potential because it's arguably already happening in the shaping of the battlefield in Zaporija area and even in Vuhledar. You could even argue that things are happening around Bakhmut that could signify uh, what might happen, what might come to pass. Right, Michael D. Weiss says, time for a new thread from Carl, the Estonian military analyst, and told to himself. Right, quote, today we can say with certainty that the success of the Russian winter offensive was extremely limited. In the area around Bakhmut, they advance on a 10 to 15 kilometer wide area, and that is all the success they achieved. Elsewhere, the front line remained either completely unchanged at Kupiansk and Kreminna in the northern direction and at Vuhledar to the south, or they advanced a few kilometers, for example, at Avdiivka, at Mariinka. This is a very meager advance compared to the losses the Russian army suffered. Ukrainian losses are probably also considerable, but many times smaller. At the moment, we are waiting for the start of the Ukrainian offensive. The events of the last week indicate that this time is near. Systematic attacks on Russian fuel depots is a clear sign that an offensive is being planned. Of course, that's what I'll be talking about myself. Russian logistics are difficult when there is no fuel and they will have to bring it from farther afield, especially when they operate usually as a railway army, but they are having to use trucks far more because of the hit on railway lines. Of course, we've seen that within Russia, but you can rest assured there'll be hits on the railways within Ukraine as well, on railway junctions. And we know that they just don't have enough trucks. They're very poorly maintained. They've had to dig out trucks that are 60 years old plus to try and help them with those logistics. So there you go. Ukraine has 15 to 20 brigades, which have over half a year of proper training in war conditions. This is a considerable number, which can certainly achieve a breakthrough on certain fronts. If they break through the defenses, the Russian front may collapse as it did in Kharkiv last autumn. Now, I'm just going to dip into, at this point, Thomas Tyner, who the other day said, looks like Ukraine will send 18 combat brigades, 6 artillery brigades, 9 offensive guard brigades, and 40 plus rifle battalions, which he says is 160,000 troops plus. Against 5 kilometers of Russian front. So he's assuming they're all going to pile into 5 kilometers. I doubt that would be the case. They're going to be split in a number of places, I would have thought. But still, like, whatever, even if you are going to quarter that, 40,000 troops into 5 kilometers. And he goes on to say, to compare, in Bakhmut, the Russians have their highest troop concentration, 26,000 on a 20-kilometer line. So even if you scaled it down to 40,000 and maybe you had 4 offensive points, if 40,000 people in 5 kilometers, all you need to do is punch that hole, have that in a few places, and you can start seeing that this thing might work, right? Okay, to continue with Michael Weiss's thread, a major Ukrainian ground assault should be preceded by strikes against Russian airfields. The goal would be to get Russian Air Force down, so they would have to start coming from further away than the airfields near the front. This would be a clear sign that the time for a ground assault is drawing near. This is in addition to destroying fuel depots and railways. Destruction of the railways will give a momentary result. They can be repaired in 1 to 2 days. I've said this before. But at some point, they will be very important when Russia needs to urgently transport more units to a specific location. And you can imagine, even with being able to repair railways on 1 to 2 basis, if you hit there and then hit there and then hit over there, do you have enough railway workers to do that? If you're doing that quite consistently, if you've got 6 HIMARS rockets in a pod, and you can hit precision that railway line in 6 places, like 5 kilometers apart, then you won't have enough workers arguably, to get on and do that. Or I don't know. I think you could really cause an issue to railway logistics. Whether this will happen in a month or a few weeks is anyone's guess, but when a serious manoeuvre starts, we will know about it. I think there will be disguised attempts. They will start attacking from direction X to see if Russia brings in additional units. If they don't, Ukraine will press in from there. Although they may not have been, that may not have been the main direction originally. I said this, I think, was it this morning or yesterday? Exactly that. They might end up doing these probing attacks, find out a weakness, and then go, "Oh, hello, yep, okay, yeah, we will go there." So on and so forth. They will seize the opportunity. So if you look at the map, Russia will have to take a longer route to bring in units than the Ukrainians will have to travel. This gives Ukraine a couple of days advantage once the maneuver gets going. What is the expectation of the Ukrainian offensive operation? The liberation of territory. The biggest prize. Remember, I shared with you Mick Ryan's brilliant thread about how you measure success, and he said that there's 6 different ways you can measure success. So actually, it's even more complicated. What is the expectation of the Ukrainian offensive operation, the liberation of territory? Well, yes, but there will also be other ways to measure that success too. The biggest prize would be winning back southern Ukraine, Militopol, and severing the land link with Crimea. Luhansk and Kharkiv in the north are an option for Ukraine. I can't rule out Ukraine trying to fortify the Dnipro River, but I don't think that is very likely. Success could be achieved in Donetsk, while Melitopol is still 60 to 70 kilometers away from the front line. The center of Donetsk is barely 20 kilometers away in some places. Obviously, Russian defenses are also much stronger there. The front has been more or less in place since 2014 there. As a surprise option, the Ukrainians are considering it. Political context. I believe the Western allies' support will certainly hold at least as long as there is hope that the summer offensive will bring military success and Ukraine will be able to liberate territory. The only person showing signs that make me worried is Macron. With his visit to China and his grossly unsuccessful message that Taiwan is not a European problem, also his talk about the strategic autonomy of Europe, which was a poorly chosen criticism of the US. China is not the right place to do this if you're going to do it at all. Macron clearly wanted to please the Chinese. Domestically, he's a lame duck after the pension reform, which means he will probably make similar unpredictable statements during the next 4 years. Russian attempts to get more support from China have not had much effect. Politically, China is more likely to support the Russians, but arms and technology assistance have come in very limited quantities. There have been no arms in any serious form. This is where we get onto me talking about, and I've said this a number of times, that if Russia loses, China wins even more. So I think China will benefit more from from Russia losing, but they don't want to outwardly say that. But I don't think they'll have a problem with Russia losing. I think they'll be able to help themselves to Russian hydrocarbons, help Russia get on their feet, have their fingers in lots of Russian pies in terms of natural resources, maybe help themselves to eastern territories. All these kind of ideas mean that you can understand if China aren't rushing to defend or assist Russia militarily. China are happy to sit and watch, learn, see what they can learn in terms of what happened with Taiwan, and not help Russia that much, because actually Russia losing this isn't that much of a problem for China, despite what many might think. In the context of Russian politics, nothing has changed. So far, the domestic situation is under the control of the Russian political elite. There is no sign of major shifts in society. It's a brainwashed and imperialist society where, at least until the next major defeat, people are behind the political power. I am surprised that Russia has not had another larger mobilization wave. Back to myself, I agree too. I think that's the only option that Putin has. I mean, this goes back to the idea that Putin can't win this. There's just nothing Putin can do to win. I don't understand. Well, I do understand that he's stuck and there's no way out, and so he's biding time. He's just biding time. Maybe the rest of the world might give up if we just let this go on long enough, because there is no way they can militarily win. And the only other option would be nuclear, but we know that China definitely don't want him to do that, and we also know that the West has communicated to Putin exactly what would happen if he decides to press the red button. So if they go nuclear, then Russia would be screwed. I reckon their entire Black Sea fleet would be destroyed within seconds. You'd have NATO air force out, and you would get and I think the understanding is it would be a conventional response, not a nuclear response. So if they use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, they would just destroy the Russian army or destroy the Russian navy or something like that. They'd just go, NATO would go nuts. And I think they've communicated that to Putin, so he's not going to do that. So what can he do? He's stuck in this situation where he has no extra mechanized equipment he can bring. He's like getting out a couple of mothballed T-62s or whatever, bringing out T-55s. How's that going to win the war? He's running out of troops now. Again, that mobilization wave that was done before is got nowhere. They've achieved nothing but a few kilometers around Bakhmut. And how can he change? What's he going to change up? What's he going to do about this counteroffensive? He's screwed. And so I can't believe they haven't mobilized, because that is the only option. But then if he does a forced mass mobilization, the society will possibly kick off in an even bigger way. They are nothing if not interested in self-preservation, as you can understand. They wouldn't be so annoyed that about the war per se. It's just like, I don't want to be mobilized myself. So, as he says, I'm surprised they haven't mobilized yet. This indicates that Putin actually is not so sure how strong a control he has over the society. Absolutely. The Russian presidential administration has for decades commissioned very thorough polls that are never made public. They are able to gauge the temperature of the society very accurately. Perhaps this new mobilization shows something that we don't know publicly, why he hasn't taken the mobilization risk. The only period when Putin's public support dropped was September to October, when there was a first round of mobilization. But maybe Putin also doesn't have the full picture of how difficult the situation for Russians really is, and that's something I really wonder. I mean, how much does he genuinely know? If we're pretty sure he doesn't use the internet, he's paranoid about the internet, thinks it's a CIA thing, so he can't properly get a grasp on what's going on through his own independent means. Every piece of information that is given to him is curated by other entities around him. How much does he know about what is actually happening in Ukraine in this war? To continue. Perhaps he is hoping for an immediate breakthrough in Bakhmut, and then the Ukrainian defenses on the Eastern Front will collapse. Of course, that's not going to happen. I wouldn't pay too much attention to Prigozhin's video. No independent unit of Prigozhin can fight without being supplied with weapons and officers by Russian army officers. These units are still under general command, not operating separately. His statements may indicate moderate fighting within the elite, but nothing more. Wagner is simply a different method of recruiting than a conventional army. I think there is a lot of noise on this topic, and it has no bearing on the war progress. On the drone strike at the Kremlin, I'm 99% sure it wasn't the Ukrainians. This is pretty much where I am. I'm pretty sure it's not the Ukrainians. Outside of that, there could be any number of possibilities. Anders Puck Nielsen has done a video saying he doesn't think it is a false flag. It doesn't have the hallmarks of a false flag. Some people, I've argued, that there are elements that would indicate it could be a false flag. So I don't fully agree with Anders Puck Nielsen, but also do agree with some of his points. Or it could have been representatives of the security structures outside the control of the Russian authorities. Usually information about such explosions reaches the Russian media and social media within minutes or hours. The time it took was more than 12 hours. Yes, it was on some minor Telegram channel in an hour and a half, but that does not count. Peskov a day later says the Americans organized it. This suggests an attempt to mobilize society, that we are facing a formidable opponent like the Americans. Again, given the overall dynamics of the war, this event is totally insignificant. It plays no role whatsoever in the grand scheme of things. The claim that there was a desire to kill Putin is absurd. He does not spend the night there. He rarely goes there at all. Zelensky rejected Ukrainian involvement outright. Usually the Ukrainians fudge it. Somebody was smoking, etc. Their tactic is not to reject, but to embrace. This time, Zelensky clearly rejected it. On Russia's military situation, the offensive capability is exhausted. How strong is the defensive capability? We will see when the Ukrainian attack starts. It is easier to defend. According to one version, the Russian military leadership is trying to make it clear that it is time to defend and hold the territory that it has won. This has no effect on Putin. His aim is still to reach the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, but there are tens of kilometers to go over a wide area. Thought that was an excellent synopsis there of the state of affairs, and probably a good time to look at this potential counteroffensive in Zaporija Oblast. Again, I said before that Chris Owicki's thread, or the thread he's referring to here, has already established that they think that this area is the most preferable, giving rationale elsewhere. I didn't go into that one. I'm just looking at the Zaporija Oblast. The three options that he's presenting, three general areas. To go to my map, that is Zaporija is here, of course. And the three options are, just to remind you, down through Vasilivka towards Militopol, down to the south. Let's get the roads back on, sorry. That's down there, down the E105 highway. That's a key hub there. That will be tough fighting. He suggests that will be actually the hardest place to take. Then there's Orikhiv down to Tokmak, Orikhiv along to Polohi, and Hilaya Belay down to Polohi. And from Polohi, you can then come down to Tokmak as well, or down through Chernihivka, or in other ways down to Berdyansk. So Berdyansk was one of the options. So your flanks would be on the one hand, Vasily is the most westernmost point, he argues, and on the other hand, down to Berdyansk there. So that is your corridor, the corridor of pain, one might say, if you're being dramatic. Far be it from me to be dramatic. Right, this thread is the third part. The first part looked at 7 different areas: the battlefield, opposing forces, attack preparation, the beginnings of the breakthrough, and key points. And that's where we got to. So this is now difficult moments. So the difficult moments starts with support from the right bank. So that, I presume, is a different moment. So let's have a look. So, as you start, Part 6, support from the right bank. Artillery support is an important task for AFA units on the right bank, but there is another one. They must restrain the Russian units covering the Dnipro River, or better yet, force Russians generals to send reinforcements, depriving the main offensive area of necessary forces. This is super important, okay? This is why feints are important. You do a feint somewhere, it fixes troops in. So you say, right, we're going to attack just in Novomykhailivka around here. The Russians send a bunch of troops in there. Actually, your main force isn't really there. They've sent a load of troops from, I don't know, somewhere around Velika Novosilka or somewhere, and actually that's where you then attack, because they've drawn their defenses away from there to support where you think you're going to attack. So this applies to Kherson, to Dnipro River, where there are a number of Russian forces and capabilities along this line. They want to draw them. They want to fix them there so that these troops aren't being drawn over to Zaporija to support Zaporija, so on and so forth. I think that's where we're going with that idea. Okay, so how do you do this? You may have to read the story of the failed AFU landing in Nodha in the fall of 2022. So if you remember, this is when the Ukrainians had tried to attack the nuclear power plant at Enerhodar and did an amphibious assault across here, and it actually failed. The Russians were defending Enerhodar too well. It's really well defended. In fact, it's even better defended now. So if this information is to be believed, the operation, which involved up to 600 soldiers, was cancelled at the very beginning because the Russian army used artillery en masse. This is their weakness. So there must be a similar situation in the Novokakhovka area, as well as in the Dnipro floodplain opposite Kherson. The Russian army spends a lot of effort to cover these areas and keeps artillery there, which will be completely useless if the Ukrainians break through to Militopol. The main task for the Ukrainian units on the right bank of the Dnipro River is to actively pretend to land paratroopers. This would force the Russian generals to maintain a defensive line along the river until the very last moment. As I said, the critical points here are the Kimburn Spit, Olapristano-Leshki, Novokakhovka, and Nodha, but in general, false landings by small groups on high-speed boats can be conducted throughout the Dnipro. It is certainly risky, but promises great rewards. So he's talking about 4 areas there. Let's go and put those on the map. So one of them is Enerhodar. The other one is Novokakhovka, so that's where the dam comes over, and the canal then comes down from there to feed fresh water to Crimea. The other one is Oleshki, which is right next to Kherson. When that renders, it should be somewhere around here. Yeah, Oleshki there, and the Kimburn Peninsula, obviously just over there. It seems that the AFU is already successfully playing this game. All sorts of Russian pro-war Telegram channels are murmuring about this, and I've talked about this over the last week or so. There's been a lot of report of Ukrainian activity along the river, and I'm saying, are they committing to an offensive there? Is this shaping the battlefield for an offensive? Or, as this source suggests, is this a way of fixing the Russians along the bank here so that they think the Ukrainians they feel they need to defend that against a potential Ukrainian assault. Analysts say the Dnipro's left bank is defended by 2 artillery brigades, several special forces division, marine brigades, 61st, 110th, and 126th, motorized riflemen, 80th, 34th, 205th, and the 83rd Airborne Brigade and 214th Tank Regiment and others. And I think the Ukrainians have been doing some counter battery work along here as well, trying to hit both air defense systems, but primarily artillery systems and pieces. Adar is under the control of Kadyrov's men, the Chechens. Perhaps not all of them are there, but are here now, but a significant part of them probably remains. They could cause a lot of trouble if they hit the advancing Ukrainian troops from the west. So it's necessary to divert them properly, which is to say, he's already talked to this source about the need to come through Vasilivka. That's an important place. And if the Chechens are in Enerhodar, they could be used to support the defense of Vasilivka, so on and so forth. So you need to somehow fix them there, is I guess where he is going. In addition to movement along the river, it is necessary to bombard Russian positions on the left bank, perhaps with the involvement of aviation. Just to remind you, left and right bank of rivers is calculated in the direction of the flow of the river, because rivers can meander all over the place. So sometimes north and south, east and west aren't so useful. So it's left and right. This will always be the left, if in the direction of its flowing, it will always have a left bank and it will always have a right bank. So we often talk about the east and west banks of the Dnipro only because left and right can confuse people, because it's kind of opposite, and it generally flows in a direction where there is a west and then there is an east, consistently, but left and right is more accurate. So anyway, to continue, perhaps with the involvement of aviation, helicopters with unguided rockets and even HIMARS, at the same time, the AFU will have to decide the site of the actual landing, preferably in Novokakhovka. The crossing is easier to restore and guard there, and the position of the city is close to the advancing units from Zaporija. So there is obviously the dam is at Novokakhovka. You do have a crossing there that the Russians are probably not going to want to blow up in any fundamental way, because if you blow up the sluices, then you screw up the water supply to this whole agricultural area that the Russians are in control of. And of course, a nuclear power plant requires the certain level of this reservoir to use for cooling waters. So the Russians are unlikely to blow it up completely, and the Ukrainians could take advantage of that. Of course, the Russians would know that's an obvious place to cross, so they could just aim for that very easily, I guess. Sooner or later, Putin's units will withdraw from the bank to the Dnipro, of the Dnipro, and here it is impossible to delay. It will be necessary to move immediately and create a bridgehead. And then we move on to difficult moments, part 7. Right, moving on to difficult moments. I think I might have said those previous parts were difficult moments. Anyway, in this part, I will highlight the break down all the problems and challenges that the AFU will have to solve in order for the offensive to be successful or to succeed at all. We must not forget that this entire operation is incredibly complex. Open terrain. Advancing directly across the fields is very risky. In order not to lose a lot of equipment and soldiers to artillery strikes, the AFU will have to move quickly, perhaps not even counting losses at this point, throwing in damaged tanks and armoured vehicles. Open terrain welcomes long-range tank duels and ATGM warfare, but here the technological advantages lie with the AFU. So all that remains is to find buried and camouflaged firing points and the tanks of Putin's army. I talked about this before. The flat ground, you've got a real advantage because A, you can move quickly, and B, you can see a really long way. And so that's really good for like tank duels and using these different weapons. However, that applies also to the defenders in terms of not moving quickly but being able to spot you. So the key is, will the Ukrainians be able to spot the Russians before they spot the Ukrainians? In other words, it's about optics, it's about thermal imaging, it's about night vision, It's about satellite imagery. It's about real-time intelligence, and it's going to be about drones. So the question in all those points is who has the advantage. And broadly speaking, the Ukrainians had the advantage on every one of those, especially if they're going to be bringing 10,000 drones to bear. What you'd hope is they can get electronic warfare to stop the Russian drones from working, but it is going to be a case. It is going to be the case, I think, that the Ukrainians will have better intelligence and a better knowledge of the Russian defenders. Throughout this campaign, and they're going to need to use that to be able to hit the Russians before they get here. Not only that, they will have, I think, longer ranged weapons than the Russians have as well. So not only do they see the Russians first, but they can fire at them from further away. If they outrange them in terms of artillery and tanks, which they do, then they will have a big advantage. Minefields. While trenches with concrete pyramids look frankly cheesy, minefields, for all their simplicity and artisanship, will be a real obstacle. This is what I've said a lot of. Even old Soviet TM-62M mines are capable of stopping modern tanks, making them easy prey for artillery. Remember Vuhledar, where it was mines that initially stopped the convoy? This is how the Russian army automatically lays mines using the GMZ-3 system. It plows a field and automatically shoves mines in the ground. The Russians really were hammered at Vuhledar, not because the Ukrainians were amazing at targeting them with ATGMs and spotting and artillery, although that helped, but they just absolutely covered the place with mines, and they used artillery to fire shells that then broke open and release mines as they're in the air. They could also do that after the Russians had moved through, cleared the mines out of the way, or done whatever, they had found a safe spot to come through, and then they'd shoot over the back of them so that the Russians, on returning, thinking they were safe, would then hit mines again, as far as I understand. The minefield has another sneaky trait. You can't see it. It's an invisible enemy that you have to reckon with and check everything and everywhere. It takes effort and time. The very thing that the airfield has very little of. I said this plenty of times. I really do think Russians mining the entire area is going to be a nightmare. Who would want to be taking that lottery with such horrific consequences? You know, driving at the vanguard of the counteroffensive, thinking, right, we are the first guys who are going to hit a mine. Yeah, I'm not really up for this. Several types of anti-mine systems will help to solve the problem of minefields, from Leopard 2R to Vicent 1 tanks to Bozena 5 drones from Slovakia, and also an analog of the Russian UR-77 Meteorit, which we've actually seen. In fact, there's more footage of Ukrainians using that offensively to throw it over and blow it up to try and blow up Russian troops. The American M58 mine clearing line charge. True, so very little of this stuff has been announced. If a couple of dozen have been supplied, it will be enough. It's good. Two large cities, Tokmak and Militopol. How to liberate them? It is possible that the Russian troops themselves will quickly flee the cities, but one cannot count on that, especially as far as Militopol is concerned. Let's say Tokmak can even be blockaded and bypassed, and then gradually stormed, or Russian units forced to surrender. But the Russians, on the other hand, will clearly try to hold Melitopol. This big city has a huge residential area, several neighborhoods of new buildings, the Molochna River and canal, an industrial zone, and an airfield. All around are solid fields, which the airfield will have to attack in the open. We're going to look at the more local environs to Militopol here. So just before we go on to the next couple of tweets, it might be worth just getting in our heads what's going on. There's a river, the Molochna River, that goes something like, I haven't done that very well, but it goes something like that. I think there's another river coming out here. You can just sort of see it in the physical geography changes there. That's probably another river that goes in there. He's going to talk about a sort of ring that goes around here from the airport. That's the airport there, down to Udachne, Novenska, and round the corner. And then he's going to talk about from Konstantinivka here to a place Voznesenka, just there. And that's what's going to be discussed. Let's go and see that in a lot more detail. Yeah, there's Voznesenka, Konstantinivka, Udachne, the airport, Novosenka, Danilo Ivanivka, and Termofivka. So that all sounds nonsense to you, but this is what he's going to talk about. The first step to liberate the city will be to reach the line from the airfield to Adachna, Novenska, Danilo Ivanivka, Timofivka. Okay, so that is this line here that I just sort of drew out before. That is there. Okay, and then he goes on to say, if the breakthrough on the eastern bank of the Molchnaya or Molochna River goes well, you can try to take Voznesenka and Konstantinivka to completely surround Melitopol. That is to say, the river that comes down through here, and that's the river. It goes, as you can see, that kind of something like that. Briefly, broadly, it says if that can be breached, then maybe you could take these two, and then you're essentially surrounding Melitopol with the use of the river as well. Lack of air support. So for such large scale offensives, air support is as vital as breathing. But the Ukrainian Air Force clearly does not have enough planes, and the Russian Air Defense and Air Force also provide countermeasures. It is clear that there will be local support in the form of AGM 88 harm missiles, anti-radiation missiles against radars. There will also be the JDAM guided bombs, as well as, of course, Mi-8 and Su-25s with unguided missiles. But all of this is not enough. And I talked about this. Thierry was talking about this as well. How I think I was saying that we haven't really seen JDAMs being used much. But I guess that this is what they're saving them all up for, to use in these counteroffensives. HIMARS strikes, which are well within range, and the active use of barrel artillery will have to compensate for aerial bombing. By the way, the lightness and mobility of the M777s, those towed howitzers that the Americans have provided a lot of, will play well here. The guns clearly have to move quickly near the front. We've seen Ukraine. I've shown you videos of Ukrainian forces super quickly firing, shooting and scooting and hooking that back up in like record time, under 3 minutes. Complicated logistics is central to the offensive. Because resources run out quickly, you need to promptly bring in new shells, fuel, food for soldiers, spare parts, and all the other little things, up to camouflage nets and tires for armored vehicles. It's not a given that you can get the main highways under control quickly, which means you'll have to build logistics along country roads and even fields. A small plus is the city of Zaporija nearby. Of course, all the cargo will flow out of it. So just to remind you that Zaporija, so there's Militopol. Zaporija is just here, and it's obviously a large hub that will be supplying this counteroffensive. This is why Zaporija is hit so often, probably by the Russians. However, this can become a vulnerability, as Russian aviation and artillery will attack the only route. Therefore, it's important to occupy and use a crossing at Novokakovka as soon as possible. Interesting. More trucks are vital, and here I'm pleased with the recent news of truck deliveries from Germany, Belgium, and the US. When we look at Bakhmut's supply routes, we see a bunch of civilian cars there. They don't carry much cargo, but they congest the roads. We need trucks. Okay, stockpiling. This problem must be solved right now, because during the attack, the consumption and losses of shells and fuel will be a record high. Indirect evidence suggests that there are still problems with the supply of shells. Ukraine's own production is not capable of covering all requirements for shells, not by a long shot. It is quite possible that it is a shortage of ammunition that is delaying the counterattack. It will also force the AFU to act faster, to have time to win until they run out of shells. The main deficit, of course, is the supply of 155mm ammunition. Let's see how Ukraine solves this problem. Part 8, the main stages. Right, first stage, a breakthrough and offensive to the line Vasilivka to Tokmak to Polohi. Deadline, a week. Okay, so that's that. That's from all the directions they might be heading in, probably all of those, as mentioned. An extremely important stage, which should be done as quickly as possible. I think if the AFU gets bogged down in the breakout battles for more than a week, the offensive may be disrupted. After that, the first Russian reserves will begin to approach the defense lines. The greatest depth of penetration at this stage is 25 kilometers. If the offensive is successful, it is possible to reach Tokmak in one day, but it will take time to liberate various settlements and small fortifications on the flanks. At this stage, it will already be clear what directions the attacks are going in, what forces the FU have sent and how easily the Russian defense lines can be broken through. I do not think that already at this point Putin's troops will start to retreat. The second stage is a fight for the initiative, slow advance of the AFUs, search for weaknesses, brutal battles, and heavy losses to deplete Russian forces. The time frame is 1 month. The key stage of the entire offensive, during which it will be decided whether a merely successful attack will turn into a large-scale counterattack with the liberation of large areas of territory. The first week will answer the question of whether the Russian army is ready for resistance or will retreat immediately to Mariupol and Crimea. And that really could happen. You can imagine if everything went to plan, if you had those drones, 10,000 drones being active, and you had this just really big punch of a concentration of forces, you can imagine the Russians crumbling. I can see that. The Russians could have two options for counterattack: trying to fit the AFU on the lines that they will break through in the beginning, strengthening the trench lines near Militopol and the land corridor. They did not dig a trench 70 kilometers long for nothing. In both cases, the Ukrainian troops will engage in a full-fledged battle with the Russian units, and here the effect of surprise will fade into the background. But the quality of training and equipment will play on the side of the AFU. If the new units are equipped with all the promised Bradley, Strikers, Leopards, and other useful vehicles, if they are allocated enough artillery and ammunition. So that, hopefully that will all happen. That is why it's important to finish the first phase quickly so that the enemy will be forced to flight without putting their forces in order. The third stage is a breakthrough to the sea, an advance Melitopol and the sea, an advance to Melitopol and the Sea of Azov, and the defeat of the remaining Russian units. The length of that would be 2 to 3 weeks. So phase one, phase two, and then on to phase three. Um, uh, to the sea and advance to Melitopol. And you could say, that's going to be Berdiansk will be one of those targets. When the AFU wins and retains the initiative, the second main phase of the breakthrough will begin. For this, they will take a short pause of 3 to 7 days to accumulate forces. During this time, the fate of Tokmak may be decided. If the Russian troops decide to retreat or are completely surrounded in the city, it is possible that during the second phase, there will be new breakthroughs of the original Zaporija front, and the goals and direction of the main strike will change, but the essence will remain the same: movement to the sea. In my opinion, Melitopol and Crimea will remain the main target. At this point, it will be necessary to expand and strengthen the flanks against the counterattack from the east, and also to strike the retreating troops to deprive them of equipment and ammunition. The fourth stage is the liberation of territory, pushing Russian forces off the left bank of the Dnipro. It is possible to break through to Crimea or to the peninsula itself. The time frame is from a couple of weeks to several months. This is no longer a battle, but rather a mop-up. It will go on for a long time, just like the liberation of the right bank of the Dnipro after the retreat of the Russian troops, as well as the eastern part of the Kharkiv region. The Russian troops will try to delay the AFU to the isthmus of Crimea by organizing defenses on the mainland, but most of them will already be on the peninsula, unless, of course, the generals are so crazy as to leave troops surrounded between the Dnipro and the new front from Vasilivka to Militopol. In this case, the AFU will need to recognize the situation in time and take all measures to block the path to Crimea. Then Russia risks losing a huge force. A couple of tens of thousands of people will end up in the cauldron. Conclusion. The above is nothing more than an imagining of how a Ukrainian offensive might go. This should not be taken as a forecast, but rather as a light analysis of an attempt to speculate on the topic using open data on the war. So that warning is from me as well, obviously. Perhaps this topic will be of interest to you, and you have your own thoughts, additions, corrections, and questions. You can email him, and reflections can be like this can be useful for understanding the future offensive of the AFU, because they contain an analysis of basic things. In any other area, all of these inputs will remain, just the locations, details, and timings will change. Thank you for your time. So I thought that was a really interesting analysis as to how the offensive might take its course in this Zaporija Oblast, assuming that that is one of the primary objectives or one of the primary routes for the Ukrainians. And I think that makes an awful lot of sense. I think hitting down to Militopol, surrounding it, getting to Berdyansk, getting to the coast is super important. Gives them access to hitting Kerch, even with a greater range of munitions rather than sending drones there at the moment. The odd Frim 2 missile. I think they really would like to get a shot at the Kerch Bridge. How far is that though? That's still 160 kilometers or so, but still would be very useful for them to be able to do that. And then, of course, it's all about Crimea, really, as I said before. So they need this area, this land bridge, to be under their control to be able to do what they need to do to Crimea. Anyway, that's that. Hope that was of use to you, of interest, informative. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all your support. Take care, and I will speak to you later.